Invite format. Great.
In which case I shall move on. So thank you very much for having me tonight. It's always fun to come and talk to you, even if we can't be in person. I'm trapped at the bottom of Surrey with no trains this week, although quite frankly, there are no trains most weeks, but this week is a special week of no trains. So I'm beaming to you into your homes, and I hope that's okay. But given that Rose is sadly immobile, I think it's fine that we're all at home so we can share her immobility in fraternity and sorority. Right, life in the shadow of General Pitt Rivers. People often ask me what I do, and quite frankly, on any one day I can be doing any of a great number of things. So I thought I'd go through a little bit what I do and try and put that in the context of the City of London. This is where I'm normally to be found, down a little hole. This is my preferred habitat, and I have as my patch the city, Greater London, as Inspector of Ancient Monuments, although I've recently been given a bit of extra responsibility and I'm now helping colleagues out around the country with some of their more tricky casework, which is proving very interesting. But this is my preferred habitat. And the job title actually has not changed. The name of the organisation has changed, but the job title has not changed since the days of our glorious inventor, Lieutenant General Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers. So I feel a little bit undernamed, but this is all part of being in the shadow. The world was quite a different place when Pitt Rivers was cutting his teeth as an archaeologist, as an anthropologist, and seeking to protect monuments. He was a great polymath, man of his time, certainly, but did great work. And in setting up the inspectorate and how that has expanded, I think it's fair to say he has done great things for monument protection in the UK. He was a good archaeologist. His work was well recorded. He had a good scientific interest in sediments and in animal bones. And if you ever get to see any of his original publications, you'll see that. He was quite an enthusiastic excavator. We wouldn't excavate quite as enthusiastically now as he did then, but of course he was quite a large landowner, so he could do what he liked. This is Wall Barrow down in Cranbourne Chase. A large barrow, as you can see the scale of the workmen in the wheelbarrows. And this is how it ended up. So it was a major piece of excavation. You'll see he scientifically left bulks so the sections could be recorded. But yeah, an enthusiastic excavator, it must be said. He was also a great collector of objects, and his collection went on to form the Pitt Rivers Museum, which built on massively from his initial collections. But a great antiquarian, a great excavator, but it's about his work in creating the first Ancient Monument Act that I really want to position him. And so he worked very closely with John Lubbock to do this, and it took them 10 years to get the Act brought before Parliament. And this was partly because of the great fear that it would impinge on the rights of landowners, how unlike our own modern times. So they had to water down the wording of the Act again and again and again, because what Pitt Rivers was seeking to do was to get all landowners of monuments to hand over their monuments so they could be cared for by the state. And that was what he sought to achieve, and naturally people didn't really want to hand over their land. But eventually they both got the Act through. And this is it, the first Ancient Monuments Act, 1882. And the strap line that I've clipped here says it all, really. I mean, I don't really need to say anything else. Pitt Rivers was seeking an act for the better protection of ancient monuments. That's what he wanted to achieve. That's what he did achieve. And we are carrying out that work now. We work under a different act, but all we are trying to do as inspectors is better protect the monuments that we have in our care. And so we are 141 years on from this. I have got my eye on the 150th birthday of the Act, and I'm hoping that we might be able to make a bit of noise when the time comes, because this is the first piece of legislation in this country to protect heritage. We were way behind other countries such as Sweden, whose first legal protection dates from 1666. So we were a lot later, but we're in advance of some. And so we've been doing this for nearly 150 years. And I'm very pleased to say that it was archaeology and it was monuments that were first recognised and first considered to be something which the state really needs to take an interest in. Now, Pitt Rivers did attach a list or a schedule. Schedule is simply government speak for a list, and that's why it's scheduled monuments, because they are monuments that are on the schedule. He had a list of about 68 sites that he thought should become legally protected monuments. But it was simply a wish list at the time, because they were all in private ownership and because there was no way of compelling owners to hand them over at the time. That list remained simply a wish list. Kiscoty House we consider to be one of the very early ones on that list. As you can see, it's tiny, so was less of a deal for a landowner to hand over. Now, Pitt Rivers was quite canny because he reckoned on the issues of practicality as well as theoretical protection. So the first monuments that he were looking at tended to be the prehistoric and the Roman ones, because he realized that the maintenance and upkeep and repair of medieval and later monuments would be more expensive and much more tricky. So he was quite canny, and this situation carried on for a while until 1913, because it was unsatisfactory that there was no way of compelling people to do anything with their monuments. And so we got a new act in 1913, and that had much better teeth, and the act applied to monuments that either were handed over to the state into guardianship or remained as private landholdings. And so the act covered all monuments, and the schedule of monuments began to increase from that point. So the 1913 Act is really the one where things start going. And for any of you that are spotters of Ministry of Works signs, they sometimes say which acts they're referring to. These are fabulous signs. Sometimes they're very strict and very strident, and sometimes they're much more general, like this one, but it does at least say ancient burial mound, so it gives a tiny bit of information and gives the detail of the act. Now, the act that we currently work under is the 1979 Act, a bit more boring, but it's still the same thing. It's still about the better protection of monuments. It's a longer act, and this one changed things a little and brought in some of the underwater heritage as well. So the guy's boat over the river in Southwark could be protected under the 79 Act, whereas it couldn't be protected before that because of the definition of what a monument is. So this is how we work now, but we are direct professional descendants from Pitt Rivers, who was the first inspector of ancient monuments, and we're doing the job that he set up. We do it now in a slightly different way. We have much more policy, we have much more guidance, and we have many more monuments to look after now as well. We're a bit shy of 20,000 monuments. We aren't far off. So I've started talking to our designation team saying, we must stack this and we must pick something really spectacular to be number 20,000, and we must make a big song and dance about it. I realise we shouldn't do that, but sometimes a bit of publicity for archaeology is not a bad thing. Now, Pitt Rivers took on the job. He was very much a part of the establishment, although he was going around defending landowners, but he himself was one of these landowners. And this is one of the cannier things that he said. The character of the inspector would be crucial to the act's effectiveness, because as you'll appreciate, you can have the most stringent legislation going, but without people to actually try and enforce it, it's not really particularly helpful. And so again, on a daily basis, say if I'm in the City of London, I could be talking to important people in the corporation. I could be standing in front of machine drivers that are digging holes in the road and hitting the Roman wall. And I could be talking to academics. I could be talking to site directors all in one day. And understanding everyone's perspective and understanding what everyone seeks to achieve, and making sure that can happen whilst not affecting the monument and ensuring their protection, is all part of the day job. And these are things that I found, learn on the job. These are not things that are taught at university. So it was quite an insight of Pitt Rivers from the very outset. This is the front cover of Simon Thurley's book, who looked at the men from the ministry, because we are still the men from the ministry. We are funded by DCMS. And it's a good read, actually. It does go through how the Ministry of Works evolved, how the Ancient Monument Inspectorate evolved, and how sites were saved. And I do use the term men from the ministry advisedly. This is them, I think, in 1924. They were men. Eventually, a woman was let in as an assistant inspector, but it did take some time. And as you can see, there's a fairly regular type involved. The military background was fairly traditional, and it's something that you'll be aware of from some of these antiquarians. Often had military backgrounds, or actually a number of them went into the military because they were very interested in things like surveying and mapping, and as we suspect, espionage. But a particular type, which we are not particularly like these days, although some of those moustaches really are splendid. Now, this began to change over time, and Charles Reed Pears took over as Chief Inspector of Monuments, and he was a draftsman, actually an architect. He came from compiling the Victoria County history, and he changed things quite dramatically in the inspectorate from the way of Pitt Rivers. And I've got quite a fondness for Reed Pears, who's rather overlooked because the shadow that Pitt Rivers casts is a very large and long one. But he did some remarkably important things for the monuments and how they were presented. Excuse me. He also had quite a sense of humour. When the book, The Men from the Ministry, was being researched, this sketch drawing turned up by Reed Pears. It's initialed at the bottom. And this is a suggestion for a uniform for inspectors of ancient monument. We think this is a bit whimsical. But if you look at the little badge here, this is a sketch of Kitscoty House, but it's actually got a smiley face in. So it's practically an emoji that he's hidden in the badge. So as I say, very good draftsman, and a small sense of humour that he's sneaking in there. But the key things were that, as well as simply protecting the sites and trying to bring them into the state's guardianship where he could, he had a couple of things that he insisted on for every site. He insisted that every site was properly surveyed, that every site was properly drawn, was properly photographed, that the sites were fenced if needed, but also, particularly important, that every site had a guidebook so people could know that they were looking at. You'll all be aware of the concept of disappointing ruins, when you trog for miles to end up in a field with a small lump and nothing to tell you what the small lump is. He was very insistent that sites were properly interpreted and guidebooks were made available. And this dates from his work. He really changed the focus on proper recording, proper surveying, and proper interpretation. And this is a significant development from Pitt Rivers, and one which I salute him for. He also had another, so like Pitt Rivers, noting that the character of the inspector was going to be crucial, Reed Pears had this very prescient statement. He made this when he was awarded the Reba Gold Medal. I am certain that some successors will have to deal with the magnificent masterpieces of the early concrete period. I'm slightly less sure about the just as enthusiastic, but he was absolutely spot on about the masterpieces of the early concrete period, which we now recognise in some cases as absolutely fantastic, part of our heritage and things to be protected and preserved. And some of you will recognise these as the listening mirrors at Dungeness, the precursor to radar. And so things like this and other concrete masterpieces, we do value as masterpieces and we do cherish them, not quite as enthusiastically maybe as prehistoric remains in my case, but some people love these far more, and they are things of beauty and bring stunning character to the landscape, as well as telling a poignant story of the past. So what do we look after now? That's where we got to. As I said, the schedule is growing. The schedule's getting towards 20,000, and we have a wide range. To become a scheduled monument, you simply have to be nationally important. Listed buildings can get away with being nationally interesting, but scheduled monuments have to be nationally important. And this is from their archaeological value, their historical value, their association, their rarity. There's an extensive list of criteria and a high bar to meet to become a scheduled monument. And so there's a range of wonderful things around the country and in London. Classic sites like Silbury Hill, absolutely unique, mysterious, old, well preserved, classic form of prehistoric scheduled monuments, and exactly the sort of thing that Pitt Rivers had his eye on from the outset. Hadrian's Wall, substantial remains from a completely different civilization who put their stamp on the country and on the landscape in no short order. Again, classic type of scheduled monument, and the sort of thing again that Pitt Rivers had his eye on from the outset. Whitby Abbey, and I hope you're all playing Guess the Monument whilst we're going along here. This is the great drawback with not being in person, because I can't quiz you on all of these as we go. But Whitby Abbey, again, these days we see this as a classic form of scheduled monument, amazingly striking, huge amounts of information, and again, tangible physical remains of a way of life that simply doesn't exist anymore. You can see why Pitt Rivers shied away from what might be the costs and the maintenance burden of sites of this complexity. But again, classic sort of site that we schedule today. This is Fort Cumberland, one of the later military establishments. This is not in Cumberland, this is in Portsmouth. And in fact, it's one of our own properties and where a lot of our archaeologists and scientists live. But again, very characteristic in the landscape, very much a part of that landscape, and very much part of defensive and military history. So again, classic type. Coming through time, getting a little bit more unusual. Gus will recognise this, and in fact, I'm fairly sure probably will have recorded this. This is the Brunel Slipway over in Rotherhithe. And so as we move up through time, we shift from major landscape features from things like Hadrian's Wall, different ways of life like medieval monasticism, through to traces of industrialization and great works. And the slipway for the Great Eastern is fantastic because firstly, it's an association with Brunel, it's tangible remains of shipbuilding on the Thames. And this one's particularly fun because Brunel built a ship quite so large that he had to actually launch it sideways because it was so big. And if he'd launched it, and I'll use the technical term here, pointy end first into the Thames, it would have shot out to the other side and ended up on the far side of the river and probably got stuck. So this is a great one. We took this onto the schedule a few years ago, and a very nice site indeed. A few years ago, I wrote a blog. So what actually is a scheduled monument, trying to set out all these points. And I canvassed my colleagues to work out what the weirdest monuments, and again, I'm using technical language, and we decided on balance that this was the strangest scheduled monument. You can see by the size of the plants in the background that this is quite small. It is a scale model of the Myrna Dam at the Building Research Establishment that was used for testing the bouncing bomb. So it is very strange, but quite significant and nationally important. I mean, the survival of something like this is exceptional. How it didn't get dismantled immediately after it had served its purpose, I don't know, but it didn't. It's here. It's a lovely site, but it is really important as part of the national story, and so that's why it was added to the schedule. And one final point, oh no, not quite the final point. you don't have to be ancient to be an ancient or a scheduled monument. Now, again, I can't eyeball everyone, and I hope some of you will know what this is. These are the cruise missile shelters at Greenham Common. And again, major feature in the landscape, major defensive structure. But this was very much a point in time. This is about the Cold War, but it's also about the history of protest, and it's about the history of women's protest, because this is where the peace camps were. And that forms a very substantial part of why this site was scheduled. But again, I can't look around the room, so I can't ask people how old they are. But this site was completed in 1986. So if we consider our age and what we were doing in 1986, we can feel ourselves a little bit ancient at this point. And it's why we often refer to them as scheduled monuments rather than ancient monuments. But again, you don't have to be old to be important. And in this case, it was decided that the physical evidence of the Cold War, the physical evidence of nuclear deterrent, but the social history of the protest against nuclear armament was one that it was felt important to add to the schedule that tells a national story. And this is the last. As we all know, archaeologists do not work with dinosaurs. We tell people again and again and again that we don't work with dinosaurs. At the moment, I'm working with dinosaurs. These are the Crystal Palace dinosaurs. They were constructed in the 1850s, and they're the first 3D representations of what people thought dinosaurs looked like. We think now that they didn't look entirely like this, but it's a fantastic site, the Crystal Palace Geological Park. At the moment, the individual dinosaurs are Grade 1 listed buildings, but they form part of a wider landscape, including geological sections that show strata and development of strata and stratigraphy, and interpret that and present it as an educational resource. And this was back in the 1850s, when most people thought God created the world in a few days, in, what was it, 4004 BC? And so these are a really interesting site, and we have a project running on them at the moment, looking at their history, their conservation need, the hydrology of the lakes that they sit in, and we're also looking at their designation as well. So I'm hoping that we might add this to my portfolio of fun things to work with. So what is it we actually do today? I've talked about the sort of sites we look after and that we're trying to protect them. Again, this is the other photo of the men from the ministry in the 1920s. Not like that anymore. We are very much more hands-on. We're very much more out of the office and on site. And there aren't many of us. This was a photo that we took on the 100th anniversary of the 1913 Act. And this is at Warbarrow, that site that Pitt Rivers almost completely excavated away. We went and had a look at some of his sites and had a great time. And we are archaeologists by background, on the whole field archaeologists by background, and learn the rest of the trade as we go along. Our uniforms are a little bit different from the men from the ministry in their spats. We are much more hard-hatted and high-vide. And this is one where myself and my colleague Sylvia were about to abseil down into an ice well that turned up in Westminster. So quite an entertaining range, and some things never change. I imagine that Pitt Rivers and Charles Reed Piers and the other inspectors enjoyed a pint after a day's work, much the same as we do now. So there's a range of things we do, but conservation is actually a very large part of it, because my job is to see that a Roman wall is still here in 500 years' time. If it's been hanging around for 1800 years in London, there's no reason why it shouldn't hang around for a lot longer. But that does mean we have to do a lot of conservation projects, working with owners and working with applicants to ensure that the monuments survive intact. This was something that I didn't know very much at all about when I started, and I had to learn on the hoof. And in fact, my first project was at Westminster Abbey. So it was quite a steep learning curve, but fortunately there are a lot of people who provide technical support for this and training, and the techniques do change, the materials that people suggest change, So it's something that you have to keep abreast with. But it's a really rewarding part of the job to actually see the sites conserved, as well as new sites being excavated. The Billingsgate bathhouse had to have a major project of conservation. About 10 years ago now, the City of London had left it largely locked behind closed doors. So we put it on the Heritage at Risk Register, which is a fabulous tool that Historic England publish every year, showing what monuments we consider to be at risk, what buildings we consider to be at risk, registered parks and gardens, landscapes, battlefields, everything really. And it's a tool to shame owners in some cases, to work with owners, to work with trusts and groups, and help them raise awareness of their site and its plight, and ideally raise grants and get conservation. And the City of London were a bit embarrassed by being on the Heritage at Risk Register, and so they did commission a project, and Billingsgate was conserved and cleaned up initially, and then over the years following, the new walkway was put in, and it became much more accessible to the public. That of course changed during lockdown, but we are getting, I hope, back to better reopening there. And so it's in much better heart than it was. It was practically black when I first went in there, because all the pollution from Lower Thames Street found its way into the site, but it is in much better heart now. So conservation of Roman remains relatively straightforward. You work with the materials that you have, you work with lime mortar, you work with the brick and the tile and some stone there, and ideally keep the work you have to do as minimal as possible. But on occasion, a site like Billingsgate will need a little bit of repointing. Same is true with the city wall. This is St Alfred's Place that I'm sure you all know. A few years ago, this one needed substantial work because, again, it had been neglected. It was covered in vegetation. The pointing was very friable, and quite frankly, bits of brick were beginning to fall off. This we'd also placed on the Heritage at Risk Register, and the work that the City of London commissioned whilst the new development was taking place around it was very good, and it was enough to take this off the Heritage at Risk Register. This is one of my favourite bits of wall, and I hope all of you have seen this. Not everyone knows about this. This is the famous wall in the London Wall car park up by Bay 52, and sadly gets vandalised, and people go and have a whittle behind it. I mean, the car park isn't that much used, and there are toilets in there, but people would go and have a whittle behind it, and people would climb on it. And so this one was moving towards the Heritage at Risk Register, because I can waive the idea of the Heritage at Risk Register as something to worry owners, in this case, again, the City of London Corporation. And so working with the Corp, we worked on a sort of rolling programme of let's do some conservation every year and make sure that things don't go on the register or come off the register. And I've been really pleased with this, because over, I'd say about the last 10 years, we've been working on all their assets and getting them off the Heritage at Risk Register. My last site visit before lockdown was the startup on this project. And about my first site visit towards the end of lockdown was on this, when the works restarted. And it's been nicely done. We've opened up air gaps, we've made it more breathable, we've cleaned it. Again, it was filthy. It is going to have a screen around it now to try and prevent the vandalism, but you will still be able to see it. And I'm sure I've taken some of you up to this one and made you pat it, actually. It's one of the best examples of Roman wall that you can see, and you can see the cross-section of, so you can understand how it was built. The setting is horrible, but again, I'm looking at the long term here, because the setting's horrible now, but in 50 years' time, the underground car park may no longer be needed, so the setting may be different. And at some point, I suspect that this might see daylight again. So long as we take care of it now, make sure it's maintained, make sure it gets a little bit of light conservation work, but nothing too dramatic, then hopefully in 50 years or 100 years' time, it may be back out in a better context, which would be the open air. And so I'm always thinking, how long are we thinking about for these sites? How long does the conservation need to last? When are we looking to see a change? When are we hoping never to see a change? And it's all about making sure the sites are in as good a setting as possible and that they're interpreted. And this goes back to the work of Charles Reed Pears. And he didn't really have this sort of thing to deal with, but he was very much about the sites must be secure, but they must be interpreted, they must be understood. And I'm absolutely with him on that. That's how it looked like at the end of the project. And I was there a few weeks ago, and the Perspex screen hadn't gone in, but it will be going in at some point. It does have a new concrete upstand because geets on motorbikes were parking their motorbikes and leaning them up against the wall, and so that had to be stopped. Other conservation we've done recently, and Henry the Hoover appears on an awful lot of these conservation projects. This is the Fort Gate viewing chamber, which again you'll be familiar with, and you'll be familiar. There was often a smell of damp in there, and there were often salts efflorescing on the masonry. And so we took out all the really quite aggressive gravel and have replaced that with a much more inert limestone, a little bit of cleaning, a little bit of repointing, and again, opening up air gaps so the masonry can actually breathe. And so that's looking much better now, much better presented. That wasn't thinking about going towards the Heritage at Risk register because the road above, the drains always leak and water was getting into the site, but that was sorted out. And so this didn't get as far as the Heritage at Risk register, but it was a handy threat to have. And this one, this is the famous bit of the Forum in the Hairdressers in Gracechurch Street. This has finally come off the Heritage at Risk register. Very pleased about this. It's horribly humid in there. It's below ground, it's below a pavement, it's in the hairdressers. And whilst again, there's a screen to separate it from the hairdressers is really quite steamy. And so this was in a fairly poor state. But finally, work again by the City of London was done, and it was cleaned up and has a dehumidifier running all the time, and finally came off the Heritage at Risk register. It's a tiny little site, but it is the only visible remains of the Forum. So it's one that we are very, very protective of. And then this rather bad photo, I'm afraid. This is the back of All Hallows on the Wall, church and wall up towards Bishopsgate, Camberwell Street. And this is a real problem because the church is built upon the Roman and medieval wall. As you can see, there's a later Tudor period turret on the back, and it's incredibly difficult to get to because it's down a very large hole, and you basically have to get into the office block of Broad Street and go through their plant room and come out of a fire exit. So it is quite tricky, and it took years trying to negotiate with the church and with the owners of the office block to allow conservation to happen. But it finally happened last year and has been conserved and has finally come off the Heritage at Risk register. So I'm very pleased with that. It was a very tricky job to negotiate, and quite an expensive job because of the scaffolding needed. We even cleaned up the parish boundary marker while we were at it. So a nice piece of work. And again, it's very useful to have the Heritage at Risk register to try and badger people into doing work. These days, particularly when money is short and times are hard, even for the City of London, you do need something like the Heritage at Risk register to convince people that they must do something. So it's a very useful tool. So conservation is a lot of what I do every day. And of course, I deal with development a great deal every day. The City of London is notorious for having its roads dug up. We have a lot of monuments under the road deck and under the pavement, particularly London Wall, but also other things like some of the gatehouses and bits of a little bit of Huggin Hill under the road as well. So I'm forever having to keep an eye on street works because they think street works are permitted development, but that doesn't disapply the Ancient Monuments Act. So I'm regularly walking around, checking on holes, checking on who's doing work. I've been out to give training to people like UK Power Network to say, just talk to us, you can have our GIS, you can look at this, you can see where the constraints are. And we're making better progress with people like them and people like Thames Water. So generally there will be an archaeologist, and you see the boots and the clipboard there, in attendance recording the archaeology on street works, as far as we can do our best to ensure. Other developments in the city, often office blocks, and often give us a chance to not only protect the sites, but better reveal them. That's something that I try to do as much as possible. And again, this goes back to the work of Charles Reed Peers. Interpret the sites, bring them before people, let them see and enjoy these sites. This was the Roman wall on Crutch Friars that was in the basement of the dodgy nightclub, and some of you may have again seen this. This was found in about 1900 and has survived any number of buildings around it, chocked up on its breeze blocks as it is. And this was the other side. This was in a separate office building. It was in the basement, as you can see. It was the dumping ground for dead photocopiers. Not a good setting, poor presentation. Languished there for several decades. I think this bit was excavated in the 1980s, but terrible state. But the opportunity came, I think we started talking about this one about 8 years ago, and it was going to be redevelopment of an office block, and that project went away and came back, would you believe, as development of a block for student accommodation. And incredibly, myself and Catherine Stubbs were able to negotiate a scheme where not only was the wall protected and given some conservation, but it was put on show. And this scheme is very nearly complete now and is visible from the street. So you can walk past this and view the wall, both sides, from the street outside, but you can also get into a public area where the wall is presented in all its glory and all its scale, because it's a big bit, this one. With the footings of the bastion as well, and being on the east side of the city. This is one of the Roman bastions. And so this is great. I say it's very nearly complete, but this is a real success, and it doesn't always happen during development, but can do. And we're about to start another scheme like this. This is the Merrill Lynch bastion over towards St. Paul's. And this has languished in the basement for decades, very difficult to get into. And this week I've been agreeing the scaffolding protection during the soft strip for the building, because the building is being refitted, it's not coming down. But part of the planning permission is to create public access 5 days a week. So you should just be able to walk in and see this. And again, there'll be a display being presented around it. So we have a way to go. The scaffold protection's only going up. I approved the method statement on about Tuesday. It's probably going up any day now. So this is one to look out for in probably a couple of years' time, as one that you'll just be able to walk in off the street and go and take a look at. Other developments, a little bit more complicated. This is City Fringes, your standard very posh accommodation tower block, and one where there was sensitive archaeology that we thought would be there but wasn't designated. But working closely with the developers and the architect, who you see in the centre here having his vision, we were able to take them along with us and say, you're going to have really important remains. We'd like to schedule them. We won't affect what you want to do. We'll work with you to protect the remains and let you deliver your scheme. That was going so well until the Curtain Theatre decided not to be round, but decided to be square. But nevertheless, constant working, Mola and Heather Knight particularly, who I think has spoken to you before, have managed to secure the survival of the site, and it's going to be in a space that's interpreted and presented. And we're currently working with designers to see what it is they intend to do. But rest assured, there will be, again, public access and nice conventional interpretation, as well as some rather visionary stuff. And I really, really like this site because we've had a history of finding Shakespearean playhouses, and then we did a thematic program to schedule them all. and they're still coming up. I've got one to go, and this is particularly poignant. The crazy paving you see in front of you is the surface of one of the wings to the stage, and this little area here is the doorway to take you from the wings up onto the stage. And there's still tiny traces of the original plaster on the edge of the door here. And I like to think, in my rather idyllic world, that the first Juliet's dress brushed that plaster, which still remains. So absolutely fantastic site that came up and has been saved during this development. So we also do standard monument stewardship. There aren't that many in guardianship in London. There are some, so it's mainly me working with the owners to keep them looking after their site. Work of conservation we try to avoid unless it's necessary, but work of housekeeping and light dusting is something that I encourage everyone to do annually. It sounds a little bit silly, but if you do light maintenance, then you can avoid the larger conservation projects. So sites like the Guildhall Amphitheatre definitely gets light dusting, just to check on the condition of the site, make sure it's not accumulating dirt and dust thrown up by the gravel. And occasionally bits do crumble, and so we do need to just attend to those. Things like the city wall bastions, again, checking on those, doing condition surveys to make sure that they're structurally sound. This is Bastion 14 by the museum, and Bastion 12 around the corner that not everyone gets to. You'll see it's looking a bit weedy and a bit vegetated, and if you don't keep an eye on that, then you'll suddenly find you've got a buddleia tree growing out of it and its roots disrupt it and bits of masonry start falling off. And this is what we found a little further up from Bastion 12. Bastion 12 is visible in the public realm, but this is the wall by Bastion 11. And I'm afraid to say that this is really secluded as part of the Barbican residence garden, but it's a good stretch of wall that we keep an eye on, and it was getting a little bit vegetated. So it's the perhaps less interesting part of the job, but it's really important that we keep an eye on this. And it's why I'm quite lucky, because I've only got about 180 monuments, and that's very small compared to my colleagues. They do tend to be a bit livelier in the amount of work that's going on around them, unfortunately. And City of London still, but not in the City of London. This is Boudicca's Mound, another one of our monuments up on Hampstead Heath. This is Stukely's representation of it. This is an early photo of it. And this is what it looks like now. And just keeping an eye on this one, because 5 years ago, this was just completely covered in bramble and you couldn't see the form of the mound at all. So working with the owners to maintain the vegetation, we've repaired the railing, we've moved the benches to stop people climbing over. And we had a rather novel approach to maintenance a couple of years ago, when rare breed sheep came and managed the monument for us for a week or so, which was great fun and amazingly popular, and I hope we can do it again. And actually the City of London have suggested they're going to graze some of my other sites down in Croydon with goats. And we've also got a scheme at the moment in Enfield where we're looking to graze the monument with cows. So we're going a bit carbon more sustainable. Sorry, I just realised that cows do generate emissions, do they not? But even so, it's a fun thing to do, and actually it's very engaging for all the people that visit these sites. The rare breed sheep was great fun, and they did a very good job, so hopefully we'll get them back. So another thing that I try to get into the work as much as possible is engagement. There's no point in having these sites unless we tell people about them, unless we write the guidebooks, and unless we get people up to them. Billingsgate, a number of you will have been to. We used to do open house regularly, and we'd get 2,000 people in through the weekend, which was knackering, but absolutely brilliant fun. And I hope we will get back to that. The man from Google came and did magic scanning, and so digital outreach these days is something that we try to do where we can. And we did a lot actually with the City of London during lockdown. We recorded various films and virtual tours and things. And so getting stuff online is also really, really helpful. If we can't get people to the monuments, then let's take the monuments out to them. And I have no idea what I was doing here. It's probably a commentary for Mr. Google in Billingsgate as well. But giving people the opportunity to do field work, really difficult in the City of London. But this was out at RAF Kenley, which is owned by the City of London Commons, which is a fighter, Second World War fighter base in Croydon. And with a lottery project there, we managed to get 3 seasons of community excavation, which was brilliant fun. Second World War stuff. The finds were fun, functional. And Guy and I having a bit of a how big was it, what was this for argument with our excavation trenches there. It was not the, what was it we said? We said it was a hot tub. That was it. Was it a hot tub for the men and for the officers?
Yeah.
Sadly, Guy disabused me and told me that it was a gun emplacement, but excellent fun. And these are still excavated on the site, and a lot more interpretation has gone in on the site. So that was a fun project. And again, you know, if we're going to have these sites, if we're going to go to all the trouble to preserve them, then let's get people to them and enjoy them, and wherever possible, get their hands stuck into them, because we all know that it's the point of discovery that's the most important and most engaging element. Yeah, or more Kenley. Foreshore, I'm sure you've all been on the foreshore and done work down there. So we're lucky in the city that we do have decent stretches and safe stretches. I'm taking my team out for a walk from Cousin Steps to Trig Lane next week. There's nice low water on our normally boring team meeting day on Thursday, so we're going out for a stroll instead. And so work that groups like the Thames Discovery Programme do, very much encouraged by us wherever we can, except in Queenhithe, which is scheduled largely for the shape of the Saxon Inlet, but also partly for the archaeology there. So that, I'm afraid, has been quite a rapid canter through of the sorts of things I do every day. I have not mentioned the endless amounts of paperwork, but that's what the job entails. Simply the better protection of monuments in whatever form it may be. Physically protecting them, physically conserving them, getting people to enjoy them and love them, and so take on the better protection themselves. That's what we're doing. It seems I had quite an eye on these sites from a young age, and you'll tell by the colours and the fact that you can get up to Stonehenge that these were quite early days when I was beginning to think I wanted to be an archaeologist. It is astonishing that I've got this job and I'm able to follow the work of Pitt Rivers. He had a very simple and very clear vision, and it's amazing that that vision is allowed to stay, that we are able to do this job. We all complain that we're overworked and underpaid, of course we do, but we don't admit that often that we have days quite regularly where we sit quietly thinking to ourselves, carrying our burden of imposter syndrome, that we have the most amazing job and we're being paid for it, and we have the privilege and responsibility to look after these sites. So the job is very different. We're much more hands-on, we're much more boots on the ground, but it is a remarkable job. And I've said that I have about 180 sites in London, and more than a quarter of those are in the City of London. And I think, without revealing state secrets, I can note that this evening paperwork was signed by my colleagues to go to DCMS to add another monument in the city to the schedule. So I'd like to think that that will go in the next couple of days. I'd like to think that it would come back with the approval of the Secretary of State. Can't guarantee that. I'm not going to tell you where the site is, state secrets and all that. But I hope that shortly we'll be adding another monument to the schedule in the City of London. So thank you for listening to that, for letting me ramble on about the job, which is a job that I'm delighted to do and will carry on doing it until someone prizes my inspector badge from my cold, dead hands. So I hope that gave you a good insight. Thank you very much.